My name is Deborah Kalb, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here today with my father, Marvin Kalb, to do this oral history interview. You were born in 1930 in New York City, and I wondered if you could talk a little about your parents and what your life was like growing up.
Sure. June 9th to be exact. And I was born in the shadow of Yankee Stadium. And it might not have been literally the shadow, but I've been a Yankee fan all of my life. Big influence on my life, but not the major one, of course. I was the third of three kids. My brother Bernard, a journalist, and my sister Estelle. We called her because it was Estelle, but I couldn't get the ES out early enough. So it was Etel, and it ended up being for most of her life. My mother and father were immigrants from Eastern Europe. My father came from a small textile village in the western part of Poland called Żyrardów. It was founded, it's interesting, it was founded by a French textile merchant named Philippe Girard. And he used very inexpensive Jewish labor. And the town was essentially a Jewish town that had very quickly in World War II been overrun and the Jews all killed. My father left in 1914, just in June, just on the outbreak of World War I. And his mother wanted him very much to leave Eastern Europe to escape what was almost certain was the outbreak of World War I. He would have served in the Russian army. Poland was then part of the Tsarist Empire and almost certainly would have been wiped out along with hundreds of thousands of others. So he left alone for the United States. And that, to me, even to this day, is an amazing fact.
Yeah.
He was 15 years old. He left his hometown, small town in Poland, ended up in Galveston, Texas, where he knew no one, did not speak the language, did not have any money, and yet somehow or another, in his way, made it as a very skilled tailor. And when I was born, he was then working in the lower part of Manhattan in what was called the Garment District. My mother was an immigrant from Kiev. At that time, the capital as now of Ukraine, but Ukraine was then again part of Tsarist Russia. And she and a good part of her family left in 1913, the year before my father left. And they came to New York directly. And my mother and father met in 1917 in New York City. It was, they later told us, love at first sight. And they got married within a year or so and had us three kids. The largest fact to leave, Debbie, on this is growing up in the midst of the Depression. It was an incredibly difficult time. And my, not favorite story, but most illustrative story of what it was like to be a kid was my mother and I, when I was about 4 or 5 years old, went out for a walk in a nearby park, met there with a cousin who had a son about my age. His name was Benji, at least that's what we called him. And she went and bought a popsicle in the middle of the summer, the kind that you could split in half. And my mother assumed, as I did, that she would give one half, of course, to her son and the other half to me, but she did not. She gave both halves to her son, and my mother was furious and hurt. And that was one story that we told each other for a long time.
Yeah. So skipping ahead, you went to City College in New York,
Right.
And you were the sports editor of the college paper. And there's a big story there that you covered. I wondered if you could talk a little about that.
The story was City College beat Kentucky in basketball. And Kentucky was the #1 team in the country, no question about it. And their team was composed, as I look back upon it now, and I could be wrong, was composed of these giants, all blonde, all with blue eyes, all great All-American athletes. The City College team consisted of 3 black kids from New York and 2 Jewish kids from Brooklyn. And these 5 kids were shorter, dumpier than the Kentucky team. But the coach of the City College team told the 5 players, he said, I want you guys to go out on the court and shake hands with each one of those Kentucky players and welcome them to New York City. Well, they went out, and just before the game started, they reached out to shake hands with the Kentucky players. And the Kentucky players turned their backs on the City College players, refused to shake hands. And Floyd Lane, one of the guards for City College, said at that time, man, he said, you're going to be eating cotton tomorrow. Some phrase like that. And we beat them 89-50. It was the most incredible victory in City College's history. It was also a front page story across the country. City College beats Kentucky. Wow, awesome.
Yeah, I mean, that was quite something. And I know, you already were interested in journalism at that point. Your parents, it sounds like, wouldn't have minded if you ended up as a lawyer. Why did you end up in journalism, and how much impact did your brother Bernie have on that?
Well, the quick answer is enormous impact. #1, my father would have wanted me to be a lawyer, no question about it. My mother probably tilted toward being a doctor or something like that. But I was drawn in a couple of directions, actually, as I was finishing my time at City College. One was journalism, of course, because Bernie was then a reporter for the New York Times, and he would bring home famous New York Times reporters like Abe Rosenthal, who became the editor of the paper. And I was enchanted as a kid, 8 years younger than all of them, just with my hand, just listening to their great stories about journalism. And so it was in my mind, no question about it. But also in my mind, because I was a student of Russian history at that time, and my brother also factored in pointing me in the direction of studying Russia. I thought it is a fascinating country. And I was studying Russian history. I had begun to try to understand the Russian language, which is a difficult language. And I was thinking, maybe if I weren't a journalist, I could be, who knew, maybe a diplomat, maybe I would go to Russia. I then went for graduate work up to Harvard at a place called the Russian Research Center, which had been set up in 1947 specifically to study. In those days, it was know your enemy, because we were in the middle of the Cold War, and Russia was the adversary of the United States. And the idea of working for my government, the United States government, in Moscow, that opportunity was given to me while I was in graduate school, and I grabbed it. I have to mention here, too, that I spent 2 years in the Army at Fort Myers near Washington, D.C., and in what they called Army intelligence. But I was working at that time specifically on the outcome of the Korean War and studying the communist side of that. So the study of Russia, then my experience in Army intelligence studying North Korean communism, put me in some kind of category. And when the opportunity came up to work as an interpreter, a translator, a kid to sharpen pencils, whatever it is that they wanted, I was prepared to do, and left for Moscow in early January of 1957, no, 1956, and spent all of 1956, part of 57, in Moscow. And it was, Debbie, a fantastic experience. Because I had a diplomatic passport. I wasn't really a diplomat, but I had the passport working at the embassy. I had an opportunity literally to meet and talk to the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev.
And he gave you a special name, right?
Yeah, he did. It was a very special opportunity. It was at the July 4th party, and Khrushchev came in with a whole bunch of Soviet big shots, including Marshal Zhukov, the hero, one of the heroes in the Soviet lexicon for World War II. And I was given the responsibility of looking after Marshal Zhukov. He was about 5'5" in height and width, and lots of medals on his chest. And I had been a PFC, that's Private First Class, in the United States Army. Anyway, I had to deal with him, and we got along famously. We talked about the Battle of Stalingrad, where he was one of the great heroes. And then Khrushchev came over, or we came over to him, and he said, "Young man, how tall are you?" And the thought entered my mind, I can't to this day tell you why. I said, 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great. He burst into laughter, and from that time on, referred to me as Pyotr Veliki, Peter the Great. And by the way, that little saying got me through any number of lines. In other words, there was a heavy security for Khrushchev wherever he went. And when we went with Khrushchev to meet Kennedy in Vienna in June of 1960, obviously security was intense. And when Khrushchev saw me with my microphone and a CBS crew, I was at that time with CBS, he nodded toward his security guy, which meant, in effect, let that guy in.
Yeah.
So I was able on a number of occasions to get little interviews, which meant a great deal at that time. In historical terms, mean nothing. But in journalism, it meant everything.
Mm-hmm.
You had an exclusive with Khrushchev. That happened a couple of times. And even in Paris, during the Paris summit of May 1960, it was the same thing. He and I had an exclusive, and we talked about everything. And one funny story I can tell you, we were passing a French boulangerie, I think is the word, and the aroma of croissant came out of this bakery, and it hit us as we walked down the street. And it was just the two of us and my crew. And he stopped, sniffed, and I said, "That, sir, is a croissant. Would you like some?" And he was always mischievous, and he said yes. So I ran in and I bought a bunch of croissants. Gave one to Khrushchev immediately. He bit into it, and his face lit up in Slavic joy. He loved it. "Очень вкусно," he said. Very tasty. And so I then really had it in with him, with Peter the Great, and of course with the croissant. And so I had a good interview with him then too. And those were very exciting days as a journalist, but they were treacherous days because we were all of these exclusives to one side. We're in the middle of an incredibly dangerous time that in October of 1962 led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was in Moscow at the time, covering the Russian side of that story. And it was so dangerous. We can't now imagine how close we came to an actual exchange of nuclear weapons between the US and the USSR. And Khrushchev, I was in the Central Telegraph where we did broadcasting then. And I had an open line to New York City because I had been tipped off earlier in the day that there might be something significant that was going to be announced. That afternoon, I remember in Moscow at 3 o'clock Moscow time. And I had my little radio there, and I turned the radio on, and the voice of, his name is slipping my mind now, but he was the great announcer at that time. And he came on, I recognized his voice immediately. And he said that there's this letter that he's going to read, sent from Khrushchev to Kennedy. And he began to read it aloud, and my Russian then was very good. And I heard what he said. He said he was going to pull missiles out of Turkey, out of Cuba. And that would have been the end of the crisis. And I broadcast that instantly. It was a live broadcast. And I think, could be mistaken, I think it was the first broadcast, the first news to the United States, and Kennedy was listening. And when the anchorman, David Schonbrun in Washington, asked me what I thought it meant, I said it meant that Khrushchev has just caved to Kennedy. And I used that verb, caved. Kennedy did not like that. And he asked Schonbrun on the QT while they were in a commercial break, tell Kalb never to use that verb because it might corner Khrushchev. It might make life very difficult for him. And Schonbrun passed that on to me. And I had a decision to make at that point about whether to use it or not. And why would a president of the United States be suddenly my editor? And I thought it was wrong. And the minute we came back, I repeated. Khrushchev had, and that is in fact what he had done. And that was the end of the Cuban crisis. It was an extraordinary opportunity. I loved it.
So you spent several years for CBS in Moscow, and then you came back to the DC area, and you were the diplomatic correspondent for CBS for many years, and then for NBC for several years. And one of the stories that you covered was then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and his efforts in Middle East diplomacy. And I wondered if you could tell a story about that experience.
Well, that was another exciting experience. Kissinger, not for the first time, but the first time that he allowed the core of American correspondents covering him at the State Department to travel with him wherever he went. So we were always in the back of the plane. There were a dozen of us in the back of the plane. He, of course, up front with his group, and he would brief us on the plane, and we would refer to him as U.S. officials because you couldn't say Henry Kissinger. So we would play games like the senior U.S. official on board Henry Kissinger's plane said, and you could get away with it in that way. Anyway, that was fun. Extremely important for me because traveling around with Kissinger through the Middle East gave me and all of the other reporters an opportunity not only to see a Secretary of State at work trying to diffuse an Israeli-Arab crisis, but also head off the intrusion of the Soviet Union into the Middle East at that time. And so we would travel around with Kissinger, and that gave me and the other American reporters with him a chance to meet Anwar Sadat, King Hussein of Jordan, King of Morocco, all of these people who we never would have had a chance to meet otherwise. But even more than the meeting was the immersion into Arab and Israeli culture and the personalities like Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin in Israel. It was a learning experience such as I could never have had at even a great university like Harvard. It just was impossible to duplicate, and I was very grateful for the opportunity of being a journalist and having that assignment.
Absolutely. So in 1987, though, you said goodbye to journalism, but you started dealing with journalism in a different way,
Yes.
which was as the head of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard's Kennedy School. And I wondered if you could talk a little about that and what it was like to go back to the world of academia after all these years in journalism.
I had received an MA from Harvard and was going on for my PhD. And I had taken my exams, and what I had to do was to hand in my dissertation. And I never did, because I then went to Russia for CBS, for the State Department, and then for CBS. So going back to Harvard was, in a sense, going back home. I knew many of the professors. I had spent then 30 years as a broadcast journalist. My colleagues, when we had been in graduate school together, were then the professors in the history department, the government department, economics department. And I was given an opportunity to be the director of the Shorenstein Center and to be able to teach. And I asked them for the name professor. And they said, well, but you never finished your PhD. I said, yeah, but, you know, I've written a lot of books and this and that and been a journalist. And they gave me what they called a professor of practice, which meant a lot to them, but nothing to me. I was delighted to get it. And then for 10 years, ran the Shorenstein Center, taught about the interaction between a free press and a government. And that is an intimate interaction, one with the other. We like to think that we are completely independent of the government, and institutionally we are. But we are dependent on the government in terms of the information we can get out of the government in order to pass on to the American people. And that intersection is so critically important. And we set up a program for teaching that, for explaining the role of American journalism, for explaining the importance of the concept of a free press, the interaction of a free press with a free government, the essential role that a free press plays in maintaining a government. So yeah, I was there for 10 years, still maintain a very close relationship with the center. It does great work under Nancy Gibbs at this point, but I can tell you that the 10 years I spent setting it up, giving it a kind of institutional life at the Kennedy School and then at the university has meant an enormous amount to me. I'm very proud of what we were able to do at Harvard, and I give my best wishes now to the center, because I really feel, Debbie, that the most important thing that journalism can do now, when the whole concept of democracy is at least not necessarily threatened, but at least talked about and challenged, I want, as best I can, to get that key point, the importance of a free press in maintaining American democracy. Without a free press, we're not going to have a democracy. So it's essential that that be maintained. And a place like the Shorenstein Center up at Harvard gives that concept life, not just academic life, but real political life.
Mm-hmm. And just to finish up, I wanted to ask if there's anything that you would want people watching this to know that I did not ask you.
Well, one question I'm always asked is, What was the most exciting story you covered? And my answer, and it's sort of a semi-dodge, is I'm not sure because I did so many of them, but one sticks out. That was the effort to kill Pope John Paul II. The effort to kill a sitting pope. Who would want to kill a pope? And there's the great line, you know better than I, and the exact quote is slipping my mind, but rid me of this meddlesome priest. The whole idea that people in the secular state of government are always bothered by priests, and I must add, journalists and writers and critics who question their authority. And in this particular case, to this day, I believe that the Soviet Union sent out a Turkish killer named Mehmet Ali Aja to kill Pope John Paul II. He got within 5 feet of him and shot him twice. Once very close to the heart, it just missed his heart. It would have killed him on the spot. But John Paul II was a strong man and he survived that. And the amazing thing about that story, Debbie, is that Mehmet Ali Aja is alive at the time we're doing this interview. And that is early December 2022. He is alive. He is in Turkey. He appears on television. He writes op-ed pieces. He's a big hero. And yet he tried to kill a pope. And I think the Russians were behind it. And one of these days there'll be the evidence to prove it.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is
It's my pleasure. Thank you. And
always
thanks to the people
wonderful
at
to talk
MTV.
to you.